Okay, guys, as promised, we're getting started on shock. Let me make sure camera's good. Sorry, I should have checked that beforehand, but I did not. All right, guys, we're going to dive right into it. The first thing we're going to cover, we're not going to do bleeding. My bad. I've got two that I'm going to record. That's why they're both up. Let me start with the chapter 26. All right. Okay, let's dive right into it. So we're going to start our trauma stuff. Here's all the stuff that I usually skip through. We're going to learn about, they said trauma scoring. I didn't see it in there, but destination and destination issues. We will talk about that, transport mode. Usually if you've got a critical trauma patient, usually where I consider it truly critical, if there's damage to the core. And what I mean by that is like you've got bleeding that you can't stop. Usually you can stop bleeding. We'll get into that with like a tourniquet next chapter. Also, if there's underlying bleeding that you can't control, like internal bleeding, things like that, multi-system trauma, stuff like that. That's going to be our critical transport mode. We're going to go emergently. If it's kind of minor, maybe like usually a broken bone typically doesn't warrant an emergency transport, even if it did break the skin, stuff like that. But as we get into all this, we'll talk about it and discuss it. Multi-system trauma. Really, honestly, when we're going to talk about a different system, and really how like we're going to kind of like categories like chest trauma, head trauma, abdominal trauma, soft tissue trauma. Really, multi-system is when you have an involvement of more than one of those together. That's where it's going to be multi-system, and usually that's bad juju, and that usually has to do with like your high car wrecks or really good fall from height, stuff like that. But we'll get into that. All right. So according to the CDC, the ages of 1 to 44. That is where the number one killer of these age groups is indeed trauma. So that's usually what's going to kill these people. Not saying that they don't have cancer or they can't die from heart attacks. There are people that are younger than 50 that die from heart attacks. I've seen it, been there, done that. But with that being said, the number one killer, according to the CDC, for this age range is trauma. One of the things that you really need to pay attention to is if you have a mechanism of injury, that's what your MOI is. So remember, when you're doing your scene safety stuff for your trauma assessment, one of the things that you ask is NOI, MOI. In your medical patients in your medical scenarios, you usually ask for the nature of illness. What's wrong? Difficulty breathing, chest pain, sick person, stuff like that. For mechanism of injury, what you're really looking for is what caused the injury to the patient. Is it a fall? Is it a blunt trauma car wreck? Penetrating injury? Stuff like that. That's what you're looking for, and that's the difference between the two. With that being said, I think I highlighted it somewhere else, but in case I didn't, there's something called a high index of suspicion. I think it's somewhere else, but with these injuries, you need to have a high index of suspicion that there might be more than what you see. And if I see it again, we'll cover it more. Basically, what happens is for trauma, usually there's some sort of energy that's impacted to the body. And usually it could be high velocity, low velocity, they even have a medium velocity. And they really talk about energy and the energy transference into the body. So you're basically taking one object and running and ramming it into another, and the damages that can occur to that. So what they first talk about is kinetic energy. Kinetic energy reflects the mass of the object times the velocity. So obviously, the bigger the object and the faster it goes, the more damage, or AKA kinetic energy, can be there and can transfer into what it's striking or hitting. So it really has to do with, and also don't forget the shape of the object. You can take something like a billy club or a baseball bat and hit somebody with it, but then you can take like a sword or a knife that's the same length, but due to the fact that it's sharp and has a sharper edge, can do different type of damage, if not equal damage. They also talk about something called potential energy, and the potential energy is defined as the energy stored in an object. And what I want you to think of is I want you to think of a balloon that's blown up. And obviously, hopefully all of you have seen balloons and you've blown them up and you've held them with air trapped inside. And that is your potential energy. When you let go, that's when it becomes kinetic energy. So if you can remember that analogy, That's usually the way you can differentiate between kinetic and potential energy. Potential means it's the energy that can be delivered. It's stored, ready to go, ready to be used. Kinetic energy is the object now in motions, and what will define the kinetic energy, again, remember, is the mass and velocity. There is a formula. I don't know how strict National Registry will be for having to know that formula, but there it is in case you need it. Then they talk about chemical energy. Chemical energy is the release of a chemical reaction. They use a match. Now, obviously, that can also be thermal energy, but what they're talking about is the fact that now it's burning. Once the process of burning is there, it's using chemicals to contain and not to contain, but to continue the actual burning. And it puts off, in exchange for the burning of the chemical or the matchstick, it's releasing light and heat. So it's a transference of energy due to a chemical reaction. Thermal energy is exactly what it sounds. It's heat. It's a hotter surface touching a cooler surface than the actual temperature of the hotter surface, and it usually winds up with thermal energy, which we usually see as burns. Barometric trauma is usually changes of pressure or sudden changes of pressure. And where we'll see this is when the body strikes an object, usually in blunt trauma, and it compresses very quickly hollow organs or the lungs, which are also kind of considered hollow organs. So that's where you're going to see where most of the barometric trauma is done to the patient, is in these hollow organs, and the pressure that's inside of that is changed rapidly to the point it can't deflate. If you go back to the balloon and it's deflating on its own, that's fantastic. It's changing pressure from inside to out. But if it changes too fast, consider like popping a balloon. That's what I want you to consider that to be like. Here it is. I did put it in here. Mechanism of injuries, different types of MOIs produce different types of injuries. We're going to talk about the different types. They're all listed here. Falls from heights, motor vehicles, motorcycles, gunshot wounds, and stabbings. Again, I go back to what I said earlier. There are injuries that you can see, and there's injuries that you can't see. Internal injuries. And until we all become Superman and have x-ray vision, we are not going to be able to see the injuries that are below, but we can have signs and symptoms that will indicate that something is going on worse than what it is in our trauma patients. So even though it may be a car crash and maybe the steering wheel's bent, but the guy or gal has gotten out of the car, they weren't wearing the seatbelts, maybe it was an impact of about 20, 25 miles an hour. Okay, yeah, that's not significant, but it is. It's kind of in that, I don't know, just kind of keep on seeing, even though you may be getting a refusal. Talk to these patients, because you need to maintain this high index of suspicion. It means you need to think that there might be something wrong that we haven't uncovered yet, or there's something going on that we can't see, and it could be for a serious injury. And that's true with all your trauma patients. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that you can't have a high index of suspicion in thinking that there might be more going on with this patient than what you can see right now. So let's dive into it. We're going to talk about blunt and penetrating trauma. Penetrating trauma, it's pretty simple. It's basically objects piercing the body. It breaks the skin and it goes into the body in any of the cavities, obviously anywhere. And it's usually going to be some sort of knife or impaling object. I think Kazmar sent a picture of a guy who fell and actually fell onto a sledgehammer handle, or he was holding the sledgehammer handle, and it wound up penetrating him because the kinetic energy was there to take that and penetrate his body. Blunt trauma is basically when things hit the body but don't penetrate. And usually you'll have contusions, which is a bruising, contusions, and it will be definitely harder to see because bruising does take a while. So that's when you still have that high index of suspicion that something may be going on because of blunt force trauma. Blunt force trauma is where I have my most highest index of suspicion. Not saying you can't have it for any other type of trauma, but blunt force trauma, nothing's broke that you can see. You don't know, unless it's an obvious deformity, like a broken arm or a leg, where it's obvious. But if you don't have the obvious, you got to think, because bruising does take a while. It takes a while. So you want to have a high index of suspicion that, especially in blunt force trauma, that there might be more damage done underneath the area that's been struck than you can see. Two most common MOIs for blunt trauma are motor vehicle crashes and falls. Again, they have the high index of suspicion. Notice that this is a repeating pattern. You need to have a high index of suspicion for these types of blunt injuries. I think for falls, what you're really concerned with, I don't know the actual literature anymore, but I know it's 2 to 3 times their height is considered a significant fall. So if someone's up on a 10-foot ladder and they're 5 foot tall and they fall from that, that's a significant fall that needs to be treated with the utmost care. Motor vehicle crashes, they really don't say how high or the velocity or the speed that needs to be traveling and the speed of the impact. They don't really give a number. So that's why you also need to have a high index of suspicion for those, because there can be blunt trauma done to the patient that you may or may not be able to see. There are 3 collision types. I think, do they list them? I think they'll list them here in a bit. As I was editing this, I was editing it rather quickly. We do talk about the types of crashes. One of the things that you do have, like for a mechanism of injury, to really think that they are very critical is if you have a death in the passenger compartment. One patient might be fine, but there might be a passenger that is dead in the vehicle. That is a high index of suspicion that this patient, even though they appear to be fine, may need to be treated for serious injuries. Significant intrusion into the vehicle, significant damage done to the vehicle. Intrusion means that basically you have the passenger compartment, and when another object or vehicle struck the passenger compartment, it's how much has come into or damage has come into the compartment. So usually we measure it in like feet, inches. It might be 24 inches or 2 feet of intrusion, things of that nature. We also look at how much damage is done. I know most vehicles nowadays are made to crumple and cave down in and around the passenger compartment. So that's great. Airbags now, seatbelts. There's a lot of new modern technology where I've seen people walk away from crashes that 10 years ago were having significant injuries. They talk about collision for blunt trauma. One of the things that they did not talk about in here, and I want to talk about right now, and I wish I thought to put slides in, but I didn't, but I'm going to talk about it now, is that in a motor vehicle crash, there are 3 collisions. The first collision is going to be the 2 vehicles or the vehicle striking something, or the 2 vehicles striking each other. The second collision is the internal passenger compartment, is the patient striking the vehicle somehow. Depending on what type of crash it is, but it's the patient striking the vehicle. The second part about this is the actual internal organs. That's the third crash. The internal organs, even though the body is struck, the internal organs are still moving, and the internal organs strike the inside of the body. So there's 3 crashes. There's the car striking something, there's the body of the patient striking something, and it's their internal organs striking something. Another injury that they talk about under that pretense is the coup contra coup. And basically what happens is, for the brain, is it will actually, in the third collision of an impact, vehicular impact, remember 1 is the car, 2 is the patient striking, the internal organs is the third. So in the third collision, usually they talk about the brain, and we'll probably hopefully cover this sooner, but I'm going to touch on it now, is a coup contra coup. Basically, the brain actually gets rambled around inside the cranial cavity. The brain will strike wherever the head is striking. It'll move forward towards that, and then it'll kind of rebound, bounce back, and hit the backside of it. So it's almost like slam. So that's why it's called the coup contra coup injury. Hopefully in head injuries, we will cover that in more depth. Frontal crashes, that's usually when the front of the vehicle strikes something or strikes another vehicle. One of the things that you can do, and people will tell on themselves, because sometimes you're going to get in some sketchy situations where people saying they weren't driving, but they were. What's going to be the telltale sign is seatbelt rash. This person was the driver. Want to know how I know this? He was wearing his seatbelt. It came down and around, and he hit so hard that the seatbelt rubbed against his skin, even though he may have been wearing a shirt or a coat of some nature, but the impact was significant enough. When it hit, it rubbed and he moved just enough to cause an abrasion across his skin. And obviously the driver's side comes from the left to the right, or at least on the patient's left to the right. And that's how you know. So that'll be a telltale sign if somebody says they were or were not the driver. Not that it's your job to investigate, but it also gives you a clue on where people were sitting. Because it might be that the driver's side took more damage than the passenger side, but you have this person saying they were the passenger. Well, okay, I don't think you're the passenger, and you would have a higher index of suspicion due to the fact that it was hit on that side, that he may have more internal damage or damage done to his body than the other person. Do you understand where I'm going with that? Hopefully so. But that's how you can tell. Some of the impact spots are obvious, but sometimes they're not. We're going to talk about collisions, especially frontal collisions, and the types of injuries that are there. One is called the up and over. The up and over. That's where the patient comes in, starts going up over the steering wheel, and winds up spiderwebbing the glass due to the fact that their head strikes the glass. They may deform the top portion of the steering wheel. That's an indication that's an up and over injury. And I'm trying to think what else. I think that's it for that. And basically what you have head injuries, spine injuries. More than likely it's going to be cervical spine or thoracic spine, and chest injuries. You can have a pneumothorax, hemothorax, contusions. You can have great vessel injuries like the vena cava. You can have the aorta damage, stuff like that. So usually with your up and over collisions, you're going to have head, high spine, and chest injuries. You can also have arm injuries as well. The down and under, that's where the patient gets hit and they wind up sliding up underneath the steering wheel. And what happens is you hopefully have an indication will be a deformed under pathway of the steering wheel, or the bottom side of the steering wheel, and they'll start having lower lumbar injuries, hip injuries. They might have femur fractures, lower extremity fractures, the pelvic fractures that I already mentioned, stuff like that. That's where you're going to have the telltale sign that it's a down and under. Also, patient positioning for this, down and under usually stays down and under. Up and over will go up, over, hit, and then fall back into their seat or fall some other portion of the vehicle. The blunt trauma, that is blunt trauma for that. They also talked about they may actually injure the trachea or the glottic opening. And remember, whenever you have an injury anywhere, the body's reaction to deal with that is to start causing swelling. So if they smack their trachea and near and around the glottic opening, which is very feasible, they may start having glottic opening swelling, and they may actually start having difficulty in breathing for that reason. Also, with the chest being slammed, remember the third striking injury of the motor vehicle accident is the body hits is the second, and then the internal organs continue and smash. Remember the barrel trauma. There's barrel trauma, so you might actually pop a lung and have a pneumothorax. If the hole is big enough and the air can't escape, it's going to start going into the chest cavity, and it's going to start causing a tension pneumothorax, and it's going to start pushing and squeezing everything over into that side or towards the other side. Also, again, you'll have difficulty in breathing. They'll probably look horrible, and they won't be perfusing well. Rear end crashes and lateral crashes. Rear end is pretty obvious. Usually we have whiplash associated injuries from that. You can have spinal injuries just from the hit. Lateral crashes, depending on the side and where the person was sitting, the type of injuries they'll have, but you got to start thinking about your anatomy now. Drivers usually wind up, if they get in a lateral crash and it's hard enough, they might actually have their spleen fractured or ruptured. They can have all the damage done on their left side. If they're a passenger, they might more than likely have all the damage done to their right side. So again, high index of suspicion for those types of injuries, not only based on the impact and the amount of intrusion, but location in the patient compartment or in the compartment, the seating compartment. Whiplash, basically what happens is that usually they're at relaxed. They wind up being shoved forward, but the neck and the head pivot backwards. They hyperextend. And then as they try to stop themselves or they strike another vehicle, they have hyperflexion of the neck, and that's how they wind up with whiplash or cervical injury, as for that matter. Rollovers, these are probably the worst. And in rollover crashes, let me just tell you that I forget the percentage or increase, but it's like 200%. Like if you come out of the patient compartment or the cab or the passenger compartment of the vehicle because you're not restrained, or even if you are restrained and somehow they break and you wind up coming out of the vehicle, the significance of you, or the increase of you dying from that, is severe, because usually what happens is it'll roll and the person is projected and usually wind up projected in front of the crash, and the vehicle comes and rolls over them. They can be ejected out and away, but remember, at that point you're probably flying. There are people I've seen that have wound up coming out as it's rolling, rolls on a window and the window's open and they just slump down and fall and like literally fall out and away, but that's luck. So ejection is probably the most common injuries, aside from all the other injuries that can happen from a rollover crash. I will tell you the hardest extrications for patients are the ones that are in a rollover and they are still in their seatbelts and they're complaining of back and neck pain. Then you have to take very careful care to try to secure them and get them out. You need a lot of hands to try to remove the seatbelt, and trying to, if you're looking to rapidly extricate them, as in there's something really wrong and you need to get them out, but trying to maintain spinal and cervical spine integrity without damaging or twisting or moving that any more than it's already been done. It's challenging. It's a severe, high, challenging thing to do. Also, if they're not restrained, and I've seen lots of cars on their tops, and you've got people usually laying in a prone position, which is face down, and you've got to log roll them and everything's crushed down and in, and you can't really do it, and you try to get the backboard in and roll them on because you've got crap everywhere, glass everywhere. You don't want to pull them and drag them through that glass and injure them even more. So these types of crashes, rollovers, are very, very, very difficult to work and try to get your patient out and treated without doing any more further damage than it's already done. So we have to be very careful with those patients. Rotational crashes, usually it's done by a lateral impact, and it's enough to spin the vehicle. Sometimes it'll spin round and round. Sometimes we'll just move it, facing it in maybe a 90-degree a different direction of travel. Really, truly, aside from the actual impact injuries, if it's no effect, or the person, like say it's not impacted on the actual driver's side, maybe on the passenger side, and there's only the driver, we're worried about the fact of the a whiplashing effect or a rotating effect to the neck. They may have some cervical spine injury of some sort in rotational crashes. Vehicle versus pedestrian. Remember we talked about mass and speed of a vehicle? It matters. The speed, or how fast the vehicle is going, versus the actual mass, or how big. Like if it's a little passenger car versus a big old pickup truck, that is very concerning as well. It'll also be an indication of where they were struck. Usually it's kind of up and over. The three collisions for a pedestrian is the car hitting the pedestrian then hitting the car, usually on the windshield, and then the pedestrian falling off the vehicle or thrown from the vehicle and them hitting the ground. So those are the three collisions for pedestrian versus vehicle. And of course, obviously, we have all kinds of energy that's being transferred, and we can have multi-system trauma for that patient as well. Here's some of the injury points. You can kind of see they put in like a different kind of mass of a vehicle versus where it could be, where they can land. Again, the three impacts for pedestrian versus vehicle is pedestrian hitting car, pedestrian hitting or car hitting pedestrian, pedestrian hitting car, pedestrian hitting ground. Bike collisions, kind of the same thing. One of the things that you will learn about, especially with kids riding their bikes, even with kids, are the pedestrian. It's a pediatric pedestrian. Kids somehow always turn into the oncoming vehicle. They don't try to avoid going out of the way. For some reason, their natural reaction is to turn and try to guard themselves. I don't know why that is, but they'll try to turn around and guard themselves instead of thinking of, oh crap, I got to get out of the way. They think, oh crap, brace for impact. And they try to brace themselves for it. And obviously, they're going to lose in that. I've had a couple pedestrians or bicycles, which are pediatric patients, versus car, and then there's some broken bones usually involved in that. Motorcycle crashes. So there's some things that you need to know about motorcycle crashes. It all depends on how fast they were going, and the type of protective equipment they're wearing. If they're not wearing a helmet, good luck with that, especially if they're at high rate of speed. But usually people are pretty smart to wear a helmet, especially nowadays. The problem is they don't wear the protective clothing that's supposed to go with it. Riding a motorcycle, they'll tell you it's not if you crash, it's when you crash. That pretty much everybody who rides a motorcycle is eventually going to have some sort of crash somehow, some way. And usually what happens, especially in motorcycle crashes, if they do what's called laying it down, means they turn the bike somehow on its side, they lose control of the bike, and the bike winds up on its side and it's flat, and then they get separated from the bike. The driver becomes separated. So usually the bike's out in front, it's pretty much hitting the ground, and then the motorcycle rider, depending on how fast things are going, how quickly the bike stops in front of them, may indeed slide or roll and hit the actual motorcycle itself. And really, what happens is and they'll still get road rash with the protective gear, like the really thick protective, like leather or specialty gear that's made, like Kevlar vests and stuff like that, or Kevlar jackets and leggings and stuff like that. They may still have the road rash, but it's really bad when they do not. You'll watch people riding around on motorcycles in flip-flops, shorts, and a tank top, and you're thinking, oh God, if they crash, they're going to be ate up with road rash. They can have some of the same type of injuries. Really, there's no down and under injury. There's up and over. And usually what happens is if they wind up striking, say, a vehicle, they're going to get ejected off of the bike. And what happens is you can probably consider that they're going to have more than likely a bilateral femur fracture. Because what happens is they get separated off the bike, they're still moving forward in the sitting position. And what happens is their legs catch the handlebars as they're going up and over, and it'll snap and break those, and they'll wind up having at least that, especially if for a head-on collision. But we talked about like ejection and laying the bike down. If they do become separated from the bike, that's also increases the death rate or the death percentage, or the morbidity of the rider. One of the things that we are going to cover, and we haven't covered yet, but we'll probably do it this week, is removing a helmet. There are some commercial devices, like you could actually pop that plastic eye shield open and slide in and kind of push in with your hands back in behind there, this little plastic balloon looking thing, and you can inflate it, and what it does, it'll put between the patient's head and the helmet, it'll literally kind of push it up and off to about the ears, and then you can remove the helmet really easily. Most services do not have that. So when you maintain C-spine, that's all well and good, but if you need to remove the helmet, because what happens is the helmet shifts the head forward, and now their body's like this and their head's up like that. It's not in a neutral position. You want to put it back in neutral position, you can remove the helmet. So what happens is you actually hold C-spine from up underneath the helmet, and then you have your partner gently come and start pulling the helmet if at all possible. The problem is that if they've got a cervical spine injury, it is extremely excruciating, painful if you start tugging and pulling if the helmet's on very, very tight. Closed-faced helmets are great. They do make the ones where the closed-face portion slides up. Those are probably optimal for us in our field. Usually some riders, especially Harley-Davidson riders, refuse to wear like a full helmet that we wear called what we call brain buckets, because they pretty much just cover the brain or cranial area and everything else is exposed. So they'll probably be ate up with road rash in the face, and maybe have some cervical damage or some facial trauma or head injury due to the fact of wearing just a brain bucket. Falls, they didn't put in here the significance of height, like I said before. So it might be 2 to 3 times their height. So if you have a 3-foot pediatric patient that fell from 6 feet, that's probably a significant mechanism of injury, and you should have a high index of suspicion that there might be more damage than what you're seeing. A lot of internal injuries, but what happens is, really, truthfully, you can actually have broken bones that's not affected by the fall. And it really depends on the height of the fall, the surface they strike, because you can fall into like some soft mud or a pile of leaves and be lucky. It could be the fact that you fall and actually land on something that penetrates the body. So there's always a chance for that. one of the things that you need to be concerned with is the fact that when you fall, yes, he caught himself with his hands. He may break his wrist. But if he dislocates his shoulder or fractures a humerus, you're wondering how that happened because he just caught himself with his hands. But there's like a rippling effect, like a damage done. The energy is transferred through, and so if he locks out his arms, now the next pressure point up here is going to be here. It could be the elbow. It can happen, or the humerus. But he catches himself here and may fracture his wrist, may not dislocate his shoulder, or he'll break the humeral head off of his arm. So there's always something, or break his clavicle, or rupture his scapula, something like that. It kind of just the energy transfers up and in, and it winds up damaging something else. So there should be a high index of suspicion when somebody falls. They say, yeah, I caught myself, a guy, my shoulder is killing me, that they may have broke their shoulder or they're done some more damage up higher, and that's because of the rippling effect of the energy. All right, we start with some penetrating trauma. It is definitely going to be low energy as far as the classification of low energy, medium energy, or high energy. Low energy penetrating trauma usually is a knife, ice pick, other weapons. So the problem with this is too, you can't just assume that you don't know how long that knife is. So when someone gets stabbed, you got to think, okay, how long is the object? You do not want to pull that object out, because you may do more damage and cause more bleeding. It's better to leave it in and in place. Try not to move the patient. Probably put them on a backboard if they'll tolerate it. And you want to splint this in place without moving it. So, and let me just tell you, it's not easy to do. I promise. It sounds like I might be making it easy to do, but it is not easy to do whatsoever. So you want to use like a bulky dressing and kind of pad that in place and just hold that so no more damage is done if at all possible. Again, long spine board is the way to go for these patients. You can put them on a long spine board, and at least the energy of movement is distributed over that spine board, and hopefully doesn't jostle this patient too much. One of the things you also need to consider is the fact that you don't know the length of that blade. It could be a 2-inch blade, it could be a 6-inch blade, it could be an 8-inch blade. Unless it's sticking out the other side, you have no idea how big that is. But remember, it went in, and it may have actually pushed up against that person's rib cage enough to actually go in a little bit deeper than you're actually having for the length. So you might actually have 1.5 times the length of the actual blade, or maybe a third or 33% more distance that blade could have went because of the kinetic energy being delivered with it. Point blank, high velocity gunshots. Point blank is obviously going to have more significance than actually some distance traveled. Angle and direction. I will tell you that the worst gunshot wounds I've seen are usually going to be 22. Not saying that the higher calibers aren't bad. Through and through is usually pretty good, especially if it's an extremity and it doesn't nick any type of vasculature, especially an artery. They're showing kind of the thigh area, which is the femoral area. Looks like it may have been possibly a shotgun blast, hopefully from further away, and he wound up picking up some of the pellets from the blast. I don't know what that is. That might just be the blood from where it was running out and down. But this guy's probably lucky, because I'm not saying they're superficial. They might be in the musculature, not in the actual skin, but hopefully it didn't get past the muscle into the vascular system. So he's pretty lucky. But 22s for me, in my opinion, and we can argue about this all day long if you want to, but 22s, especially point blank to the head, are worse. They don't have enough velocity to come and typically make an exit wound. So what happens is they're ricochet inside the cranial vault. So they wind up, a gunshot wound to the head is probably lethal, but now it's going to be even worse if it winds up going and striking inside the cranial vault and ricocheting in. 22 point blanks can travel the distance of the bone. It'll go in, strike the bone, and change angle and start heading up into like the abdominal cavity, the thoracic cavity. 22 point blank, we usually sometimes we'll catch a bone and ride it out and do more damage than good. So just because it's a 22, don't think, oh, it's okay. You need to have a high index of suspicion that there might be more damage done, even though it's a lower caliber weapon. They want you to find the number of penetrating injuries. Obviously, if you've got 2 in the front and you don't have 2 exit wounds, that means the bullet's still lodged. It's inside the body somehow, some way. And obviously, it can't stay there and it needs to come out. What these people need now is a surgeon. And that's going to be true in most of your high impact energy, your really bad trauma. There's nothing really you can do but try to just keep them hemodynamically stable. You can try to give them fluids to try to keep their blood pressure at a certain point, to perfuse the brain. But basically what happens is if they're bleeding out somewhere and you're not replacing it with blood, you're just replacing it with fluid, there's no oxygen carrying capability. Good job keeping their blood pressure up, but they're not moving enough oxygen now around because they're losing all the hemoglobin off the red blood cells into wherever cavity is bleeding, even if it's external bleeding. So surgery is the only way to go. They do talk about the types of different bullets. I'm not going to really go into it, but hollow points have like a hole in the front, and so when they impact, they mush out and bust open. They talk about full metal jackets do less damage because of the way they're packaged and come, stuff like that. Just keep that in mind, I guess. And really, truly, if you can find out on scene what this person was shot with, fantastic. If you can't, you've got to treat what you can. High index of suspicion. They need surgery. They need to be CAT scanned or scanned, or an MRI machine. Probably not an MRI machine, especially if bullet's still in there, because the MRI will pull the bullet out, but it'll pull it out through like magnetics anyways. But like they need CT, and they need to find out where the bullet is and how much bleeding and how extensive the damage is, and they need a surgeon. That ultimately they need surgery. One thing with penetrating, especially with bullets, high velocity, there's something called cavitation. And what happens is you'll have the entry wound or the entry come into the body, anywhere in the body, doesn't matter. And there's so much energy coming in, when it hits, the energy starts to distribute out. Well, it pushes and shoves everything out and away. So even though there might be a clean through and through, damage is going to start happening because the energy is now being transferred to push out and away from the body. So this is called cavitation. And usually the exit wounds will look worse than the entry wounds because all that energy is now being transferred to the body and it blows out the backside. So there's a lot of damage that could be done by a gunshot wound, not just the path of travel, but the fact that there's energy being transferred out and up and it's slamming it open like that. There's more energy there to be distributed through the body, causing more damage. And that is called cavitation. It's when it comes in, the energy is transferred to the body, and the energy starts going out and away from the actual path or the trajectory path. And it opens up this temporary cavity, and then it'll come back and slam shut. But too late, too little, too late, the damage has been done, and the energy coming out will blow out a bigger exit wound. So how you can tell, and not that it's up to you to figure out, but if you can kind of figure it out when you're doing your rapid trauma survey, your head-to-toe assessment on this patient, you see small hole here, large hole here, that's probably the path it took. Hopefully it's a through and through, and the exit wound will be bigger. So I'm assuming the person got shot in the front of the hand or the palm of the hand, and then it came through and kind of blew out some of the skin, and then the damage there is what they're trying to show you there. Blast injuries. Okay, so typically blast injuries is going to be an explosion. I mean, obviously, it's a blast. Captain Obvious here. So what you have is you have 4 parts. There are 4 parts to a blast injury. You have the primary blast. And what the primary blast is a pressure wave. It's the displacement of a change in air movement. And this is where you could have significant barotrauma to the lungs, to the hollow organs. It's the pressure wave. It's the displacement of the air out and away very quickly. And so you'll have this primary blast. That's actually the pressure wave that you feel, the knockback that you feel from the blast. They go into it as well, but I'm going to cover it here. The secondary blast injury is going to be all the crap that just blew up. So your primary is the pressure wave, and it could cause barotrauma. The second is penetrating or penetrating trauma. It's blunt trauma from the primary blast. The secondary blast is the penetrating trauma from all the crap that just exploded into pieces and being flung at your body. So now there you are, being pushed, shoved, knocked over, flying through the air. Crap is hitting you and penetrating your body or causing blunt force trauma. The tertiary blast injury is with you hitting the ground or another object, being thrown against the ground or another object. That's the tertiary. So primary is the actual pressure wave blast. The secondary is the parts and pieces while you're flying through the air. It's actually going faster than you and hitting you. Tertiary is you actually hitting something because you landed on it from the blast. The quaternary blast. The quaternary blast is the stuff that happens once the blast is complete. So you have the blast. You have the primary, secondary, and tertiary. You've landed on the ground. Primary, secondary, and tertiary is now complete. You've landed on the ground. The explosion is done and over with. Now, the quaternary blast has to do with things being on fire, burning you. Like there can be burns, stuff like burning close to you and burn your skin, or fall on you. Things that fall on you, like it might be a building that explodes and rubble and debris falls on top of you. That could be quaternary. Basically, anything resulting from the blast that wasn't caused. Well, it's caused by the blast, but the blast itself doesn't cause the damage. So yes, we blew up a side of a building and we have the primary blast wave. The stuff's flying everywhere that got exploded. You finally hit the ground. But then when the blast is technically over, you still have falling debris, things on fire. Those are the things that are going to affect you. We kind of talked about it here. They cause some other stuff like biological, chemical, or radioactive contaminants. If it's a nuke bomb, chemical bomb, biological agent that was inside of the bomb, now there you are breathing in a biological or chemical as part of it. That's also a quaternary injury. So the tissues at risk, the organs that contain air, hollow organs, that wind up being susceptible to the barotrauma, tympanic membranes inside the ears, your tympanic membranes that help you hear, pulmonary blast to the chest. You can start having pulmonary damage and great vessel damage done. You can wind up with a pneumothorax, and it could start to tension. I know we haven't done chest trauma, but that's... If you look that up, help you get ready for chest trauma. So then we're down to multi-system trauma. Again, this is one or more. It's more than one. It's two or more, in my opinion. Two or more body systems. So you might have abdominal trauma and chest trauma, multi-system trauma. You might have extremity trauma and chest trauma, multi-system trauma. Head trauma and chest trauma, multi-system trauma. However you want to look at it. So... when we start doing your assessments, they talk about getting your assessment done in 10 minutes, especially your rapid trauma survey. There's a reason for that. It's called the Platinum 10. They want you to be on scene, and it starts from when you arrive on scene, not from when the injury occurred, but they want you to be gone and up in 10 minutes. It's called the Platinum 10. They also talk about something called the golden hour. The golden hour is when they want that patient from the time you arrive on scene to actually inside a hospital and having surgery in an hour. It's called a golden hour. That's what they have, the Platinum 10, golden hour. That Platinum 10 is the first 10 minutes of the golden hour. We will talk more about this in your shock therapy. This is all stuff that's on there. Spinal mobilization, transport, stuff that you're trying to do. Now, your patient assessment. You're looking for life-threatening injuries. Something called DCAP BTLS TIC. I'll try to get it on paper. I'll try to talk to you guys about it. Hopefully I'll cover it on lab. I probably will now that I've said it. The whole point of this is in your patient assessment, for your trauma patient assessment, is to get them off and gone in 10 minutes. Now, if I remember correctly, once you say... you've got to do your scene seisma, your general impression, level of consciousness, any life threats that you control right then and there, your ABCs. You're going to make a transport decision, get a sample history, and then you're going to do a complete physical head-to-toe assessment. This is a rapid assessment. You're just looking for any injuries. Obviously, if there's obvious injuries, they're there. But the reason why you do this is because those obvious injuries can be very distracting. Like, oh, their leg is broke. Well, they may have a head injury too. If they have a head injury and they start having irregular respiration, the hell with the leg. We need to get airway secured and then breathing properly, and hopefully control the bleeding from that leg. So it's to keep you from being completely distracted by the gross, obvious injuries. So it's head to toe. DCAP BTLS stands for deformities, contusions, abrasions, penetrations or punctures, tenderness, lacerations, swelling. And then TIC is also tenderness, instability, and crepitus. Crepitus is the feeling of bones rubbing together. And it's like this grating chalkboard fingernails sound, fingernails across a chalkboard. And when you feel the crepitus, you'll know. You'll feel it's like, oh, that feels horrible. Like, ugh, it's that grating sound. You'll actually feel it in your hands. It's really weird. Sometimes you'll have a multi-casualty incident. We've talked about that. There's more than just one or two patients. Remember, multiple casualty incident is where your initial responding service resources is taxed. So they may have 20 ambulances and they're using all 20 on this one call, or they have 10 out on other calls and they take all 10 to come because they have 20 patients, they're taxed. Or they can have 2 ambulances, one's out on a call and one gets called out to 2 patients, and they can only have 1 ambulance to treat and transport the 1 patient, they're taxed. So it all depends on the type of the service and the number of resources they have. So the idea is to be quick about this. So when you start your trauma assessment, as soon as you say BSI PPE, your time stops. When you're done from your head to toe assessment and you finish with the arms and you finish with the posterior and the back and the lower extremities, and you're on the spine board, all right, we're strapping the patient down, we're on the stretcher, we're in the back of the ambulance, and we're now en route to the hospital, your time stops. Your scenario doesn't stop, but your time stops. That's how I remember registry to be. And I'm assuming it's probably still going to be true. So but you keep in mind, even though you got off the scene in 10 minutes, it may not actually stop your treatment of the patient. So you may still have to go, all right, now that I'm in the back of the ambulance, we're on our way, we're looking to get large bore IVs, we're looking to do shock management, keep the patient warm, do Trendelenburg, keep patient's feet elevated, things of that nature. Injuries of the head, the neck, we talked about what DCAP BTLS means, controlling the airway problems, chest problems, any injuries that might actually obscure breathing and the airway. Always reassess your patient every 5 minutes. You're looking for injuries to the abdomen, solid lacerations or fracture. Believe it or not, you can lacerate or fracture a solid organ. There's a trauma triad, coagulopathy, hypothermia, and acidosis. Meaning that coagulopathy means they're losing, because remember, they're bleeding. All the clotting factors are in the blood. If they cannot control bleeding and they're bleeding out, they will not be able to clot or coagulate, which is clotting. Hypothermia, they're actually going to start losing heat, keep them warm. Acidosis, because they're losing the hemoglobin that transfers oxygen and CO2, they're going to start retaining CO2 because there's not enough hemoglobin in the blood. You're losing red blood cells to actually drop off oxygen, which is hypoperfusion, which is shock. Also, on the flip side of that is it's not delivering oxygen. Well, they're also not picking up the CO2. You're not delivering and picking up anymore. So therefore, you're going to have acid buildup because of CO2. Therefore, they're going to become acidotic, which is even worse. So there's that whole death triad that you need to be worried about. C time, we talked about less than 10 minutes, your platinum 10. Talked about dangerous MOI. Decreased level of consciousness is bad. That means they're either bleeding out and they can no longer maintain their blood pressure, or they have a head injury or something is making them altered. And we've got to make sure we assess ABCs over and over and over again and try to control our bleeding, make sure our airway is good and that they're at least oxygenating well, and try to keep as much blood inside the container than out. Some things that you consider, depending on where you live and the type of trauma centers that you have in and around you, you might have to fly them. Call for them early, call for them often. All the air medical services do not mind being actually getting in, lifting off, and flying, and you cancel them in mid-flight. They don't mind. They don't care. They're there to do what you do. They want to respond to the critically ill or injured patient, and they don't care if they got to come and you got to cancel them. Even in your stroke patients, you get called out for a stroke patient, you take a blood sugar, oh, it's low, you cancel them and give the patient what they need, some sort of dextrose. So protocols will indicate what you can and can't do, and that'll be based on what service you work for. They do have this kind of criteria for air medical, 20 to 25 miles. If you can't ground pound them and it's over that distance. Usually, I know at my service, we started carrying blood products. We're kind of like the trial. We're one of the 3 counties in and around surrounding counties with the one of the local hospitals for doing that. But I've called a helicopter working in the remote area in which I live in and work in. I've called for helicopters just simply because I needed blood. I've called them and said, look, I called you. I'm sorry you're taking over care. I don't mean to do this to you, but you have blood products. And this patient absolutely needs blood and blood products. So there you go. Also, multiple casualty incidents. If you need to go ahead and fly the most critical patients so you can turn around and go back to scene and take care of some of the walking wounded, that's also a feasible idea. Destination selection, you want to really take them to a level 1 trauma center if at all possible. Level 2 is okay if they're not totally critical, but if they're extremely critical, they probably want to go to level 1. And there you go. Level 1 has the most resources, followed all the way down, and that should be it for this. All right, there we go, guys. I'm going to post this, and I'm going to work on the other one.